So I'll repeat that for the sake of the recording. Last week we talked about classes. We talked about how we create classes, how we write classes, and then how we create objects from those classes. This week, I want to go into a little bit more detail about how you create those classes and some important information about how to read classes that other people have put together, and just some general syntax. So there is a special function or method called init. Notice that there are 2 underscores before it and after it. When you put 2 underscores before and after a method name in Python, those are reserved methods. Reserved methods are methods that are used for specific purposes that Python is looking for when you do certain things. And I introduced the __str method. That was, I believe, earlier this week. That works when you cast something as a string. This one is something that initializes an object. In other words, when you create an object like this class is being created as a myPet object, so the pet class is being created as a myPet object. When you create that object, the init function gets called. Now, in computer science speak, this is called a constructor. And what it helps to do, the reason it's called a constructor, is this function, this method, helps to construct the object from the class. So what happens here is that this constructor takes an argument called name. I'm going to skip the self thing for a second. It takes an argument called name, and it assigns that name to the name of the pet. So the pet's name is now set to Peter. That's what this init function is doing. Now, you see here that there are a couple different things called name. There's this self.name, and then there's just name without the self. In Python, whenever you call a function on a class, on an object, there is a variable that automatically gets passed to that function, and that variable is called self. So this self variable contains all of the properties of the object itself. All right, until you start to use it, it doesn't really make sense. And then once you use it more and more, then you get a feel for what self actually is. But self, you can think of as myPet. It's equivalent to myPet inside of the class. So it allows you to then get all of the attributes of the object and get all of the methods of the object. So you could call all sorts of functions that are contained in this class by calling self. And what's happening here is that when pet is called with this argument Peter, because pet is the name of the class, it automatically, Python is automatically looking for this init function. Right? It's a special function that's called when the class is first initialized. It's automatically looking for this init function. If this init function doesn't exist, it will actually cause an error. But as long as this init function exists, it will look for this function, and then it will look to match up any arguments you give with all the arguments after self. You have to write self, comma, any other arguments you want to give. So we could write pet Peter and then put in quotes dog, and then 12 for how old Peter is. And if you had 3 arguments that you gave when you initialized the object, then you would also need to have 1, 2, 3 arguments after the self argument. So then inside of this initialize method rather, what this particular thing is doing is taking that self, taking that object, and saying the name attribute on that object is equal to this name right here. This name is not the same thing at all. This only exists on the myPet object. This name is what's being passed right here, Peter. Peter goes here, and then it goes here, and then it gets assigned to the object's name attribute, which are 2 totally different variables. So that by the time the next line of code is called myPet.name, it's going to be looking at self.name and printing that out. And so that will print Peter. Okay? I know that's complex. Any questions? Any questions about that? I was going to also try to live stream to YouTube in case people get kicked from Zoom. Although my computer might not cooperate because I'm trying to do too many things. Questions about classes, the init function, attributes versus methods? Yes, I really want that account. Fine, go live. All right, let me go to the second slide while that loads, and then Dwight, I'll put that link into the chat once it comes up. Right, so to reiterate about self, self is a way of referring to the instance within a function, the instance of the object. So if you understood what I just explained, you should be able to answer this question. What does self.name do, and how does that relate to what myPet.name does? So what does self.name do? And here's the link in case you get disconnected. So someone chime in, either unmute yourself. Oh, I'm listening to myself now. So please chime in if you have an idea. What does self.name do? Who can recap what I just mentioned? Go ahead, Ayana.
By using the self keyword, you can access the attributes and the methods of the class.
Excellent. Self allows you to access the attributes and the methods. So what does self.name have to do with myPet.name? First of all, are they going to contain the same information? Self.name and mypet.name.
Um, no, because they have different names, and that makes them different variables, I think. Or am I going off?
So you're writing different code to reference them, but they do contain the same information because mypet.name refers to this self.name variable within mypet. So in other words, this mypet.name is pointing to self.name. All right, in memory. So that's more of an 11th grade thing about the memory and the CPU and everything. But that's what's happening behind the scenes. All right, it's referring to the same bit of memory. So this is essentially the same thing. It's just in a different context. This is in a broader context, so you have to be specific about what object you're talking about. But within pet, self.name is the same thing, the same attribute. Okay? And again, this is one of those things that is going to take some time. If you're not familiar with it, you're not comfortable with it, that's okay. It's going to take some time to get used to. And as you code it, you'll understand how it works. Any other questions? This is it for just the 2 slides. This is it for today. It's probably plenty. But any other questions about this? If not, we'll spend the rest of the time on Replit.